Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for May 28th, 2021. And this episode is the third in a series covering papers from one of the most prominent anti-federalist writers, Brutus. Today I've got an overview of his third paper published in November of 1787. And here in this third paper, he moves from some more general discussions that he covered in his first two to some of the specifics as to why he opposes ratification of the Constitution. And here he talks about issues with representation, not just in the House, but even the federal structure in the Senate. And he also touches on some problems with representation in general, but he spends quite a bit of time talking about the 3/5 clause and his opposition to slavery as an institution. I'm going to cover all that in a moment, but first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives. On individual episodes like this one today, I'll include a bunch of links so you can read and learn more. I've got even a few different episodes for you to check out in conjunction with this one. You can find all the different platforms we're on, both video and audio-only podcast edition, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I want to start out by pointing you in the direction of the previous two episodes. I won't list these as I get pretty deep into the series, but I thought I'd mention these first two, at least on this episode. First of all, last October, I did The Dangers of Consolidation, Antifederalist Brutus #1. And then I followed up in April of this year, Consolidation versus Natural Liberty, Antifederalist Brutus #2. Those will both be linked in the show notes. They're not long episodes, but they're packed with really interesting info. So let's get right to his third paper, published November 15th, 1787. And after a very brief introduction and a note to the citizens of the state of New York, he points out that the Constitution has some good parts, or at least seemingly, but under the hood, he thinks there's some serious problems. And here's how he put it. On a careful examination, you will find that many of its parts of little moment are well formed. In these, it has a specious resemblance of a free government. But this is not sufficient to justify the adoption of it. The gilded pill is often found to contain the most deadly poison. Ain't that the truth? And he follows up, he says, but that doesn't mean we have to just reject or support. We have to base it on the pillars, the foundational pillars of a free government. You can't expect something perfect. And that's what he said. He says, you are, however, not to expect a perfect form of government any more than to meet with perfection in man. Your views, therefore, ought to be directed to the main pillars upon which a free government is to rest. And after hearing his examination, he's hoping that the reader will say, well, is this based on the pillars that can create a free government? If so, then vote yes. And if not, reject ratification. Going forward, he summarizes his first two papers. In the first one, he says, I have attempted to show that a consolidation of this extensive continent under one government for internal as well as external purposes, which is evidently the tendency of this Constitution, cannot succeed without a sacrifice of your liberties. We know consolidation, all the founders opposed consolidation, which is a centralization of power, but very few explained why. It was just widely understood that consolidation was going to lead to a destruction of liberty. The debate was primarily over whether or not the new Constitution would lead to a consolidation or not. But Brutus actually, in that first paper, he backs it up a bit, and he goes through point by point, a number of very serious points, gives probably what might be the best overview of why consolidation or centralization of power is a problem. And then in his second paper, here's his summary. He says, and then I have shown, independent of this, that the plan is radically defective in a fundamental principle which ought to be found in every free government, to wit, a Declaration of Rights. And there in that second paper, and I covered that in the episode as well, he is focusing heavily on a natural liberty, natural rights foundation, but the problem with having a lack of a Bill of Rights. Here's how historian Tara Ross summarizes what he gets into when he's covering the specifics. She says, Brutus is very upset about the manner in which congressmen are apportioned among the states. He summarizes, next up, what is known as the 3/5 clause. And here's how, and I actually covered that 3/5 clause, the history behind it, or the compromise, in an episode in the April of this year. There's some interesting history going all the way back to the Articles of Confederation. I will link to it in the show notes so you can check that out, especially in conjunction with this episode. But here's how Brutus summarizes it, and he doesn't pull any punches. He says, what a strange and unnecessary accumulation of words are here used to conceal from the public eye what might have been expressed in the following concise manner. So he's basically rewriting what became the 3/5 compromise, or the 3/5 clause. And this is what he suggests. Representatives are to be proportioned among the states respectively, according to the number of freemen and slaves inhabiting them, counting 5 slaves for 3 free men. But he's pointing out, and he cites the celebrated Montesquieu, that slaves can't really have any say. They have no share in the government. So he says, if they have no share in the government, why is the number of members in the assembly to be increased on their account? Is it because in some of the states a considerable part of the property of the inhabitants consists in a number of their fellow men who are held in bondage in defiance of every idea of benevolence, justice, and religion? And this is pretty good too. He's actually going back to the Revolution, the principles on which the Revolution were founded, the Declaration of Independence as well. He says, and contrary to all the principles of liberty which have been publicly avowed in the late glorious Revolution. And he's right to call out the hypocrisy of that. And he was far from alone in doing this. This was not just a tiny niche opinion. This was relatively common to hear this type of thing. Like, if you're supporting the principles of the late glorious revolution, if you believe in the principles of liberty, how can you actually be okay with this? Going forward, he says, what adds to the evil, he says it makes it even worse, is that these states are to be permitted to continue the inhumane traffic of importing slaves. He finds the whole institution to be abhorrent, to be evil. He says, until the year 1808, and for every cargo of these unhappy people, which unfeeling, unprincipled, barbarous, and avaricious wretches may tear from their country, friends, and tender connections, and bring into those states, they are to be rewarded by having an increase of members in the General Assembly. I think this is the type of stuff that probably resonates quite a bit with people today. And even though it wasn't just a tiny amount of people who held this type of view, it certainly wasn't the most popular opinion of the time. But he doesn't hold back at all. He still holds his principles and he pushes it out there. He's like, look, anyone who's taking someone away from their family, from their home, to be held in bondage, these are unprincipled, unfeeling, barbarous, and avaricious wretches who would do such a thing. Going further back to Tara Ross as well here, this is getting into the Senate. And if you check out some pages, like, for example, Brutus in Wikipedia, they cite him as being fully on board with equal representation in the Senate. But here in paper number 3, he actually isn't. So maybe we'll find out that he changes his mind a little bit later. Maybe not. Maybe just Wikipedia is not a reliable source. Who knows? And here's how Tara puts it. She says, Brutus is also upset about the equal representation for each state in the U.S. Senate. And this is how he put it, quote, how unreasonable and unjust then is it that Delaware should have a representation in the Senate equal to Massachusetts or Virginia, the latter of which contains 10 times her numbers and is to contribute to the aid of the general government in that proportion. So he's pointing out, he's focusing more on a democratic type of approach. And that was relatively common amongst the Anti-Federalists. Of course, Brutus was very popular in his writing, so some people were thinking they didn't like the kind of mixed government, part representative, part federal, part national, part federal. So he's actually rejecting that idea in paper number 3. And then he kind of stumbles into this problem with representation as a general concept. He doesn't go real far with it, but I think a lot of us today recognize this type of thing as well. He says those who are placed instead of the people should possess their sentiments and feelings. This is the notion of representation. The idea is you have to have enough people that can be in the representation to have a good overview of the feelings, the views, the sentiments of the people that they're representing. So the idea that you only have one representative for however many tens of thousands of people is really problematic. It makes it actually impossible. And he goes on, he says, they should possess their sentiments and feelings and be governed by their interests. Or in other words, should bear the strongest resemblance of those in whose room they are substituted. He says one man or a few men cannot possibly represent the feelings, opinions, and characters of a great multitude. He said it's just impossible. You can't really have representation when you have one person trying to take the view of thousands and thousands of people and put it into one piece of policy. It's just impossible. He says, in this respect, the new Constitution is radically defective. The House of Assembly, which is intended as a representation of the people of America, will not, nor cannot, in the nature of things, be a proper one. 65 men cannot be found in the United States who hold the sentiments, possess the feelings, or are acquainted with the wants and interests of this vast country, and it's actually far worse than that today. And he says this type of thing leads to corruption. If you just have one person trying to take the views of thousands, you cannot have an honest end result. You get corruption and bribery, he says. This branch of the legislature, he writes, will not only be an imperfect representation. Of course, you can't have perfect, but you want to work closer to it. He says, but there will be no security in so small a body against bribery and corruption. Wow, he nailed it on that one. Even if we disagree with some of the other stuff he has to say, but he takes a really strong principled approach against slavery, against the notion of putting people in bondage, but this idea that, wow, it's impossible to represent people as well. And he certainly called it that it would lead to corruption in that body. He says it will consist at first of 65 and can never exceed one for every 30,000 inhabitants. A majority of these, that is, 33, are a quorum, and a majority of which, or 17, may pass any law, so that 25 men will have the power to give away all the property of the citizens of these states. 25 human beings for tens and hundreds of thousands of people. Today, I don't even have the calculation in my head, but it's just a few hundred people are making the decisions on the property, the lives, and liberties of a few 100 million people. This is not representation. This is domination. He says, what security, therefore, can there be for the people where their liberties and property are at the disposal of so few men? It will literally be a government in the hands of the few to oppress and plunder the many. And then he ends on a pretty pessimistic note. He says, the more I reflect on this subject, the more firmly am I persuaded that the representation is merely nominal, a mere burlesque, and that no security is provided against corruption and undue influence. And he says, no free people on earth, none ever, who have elected persons to legislate for them, ever oppose that confidence in so small a number. And he gives some other examples, Great Britain, basically saying this is a much smaller number than others who have claimed to be free or tried to be free. So this is not going to lead to liberty in the long run. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I hope it was fun to watch or listen to. I can't thank you enough for spending some of your time with me today. If you enjoyed the show, you enjoyed this episode, you like the work that we do at the TAC, You can help us spread the word by doing a few free and easy things right now. That is, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Smash the like button, subscribe, get notifications, leave comments primarily in the archives, share links to the episode. All that stuff tells the algorithm, primarily of the mainstream platforms, to show the program to more people, and it really, really helps us a lot. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, you can also put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month with our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.